Hey guys, Matt Allen here. Welcome back to TacticalBassin. Today we're doing a frog review. We've got 14 different frogs from all sorts of different companies, and we're going to talk about the benefits of each one. Whether you're that guy that's just looking for one frog that will do everything, or you're that guy that's a total tackle junkie looking for that frog that everybody else has overlooked, there's something here for you. We're going to break these frogs into 4 different categories. We're going with small frogs, great big frogs, popping frogs, and then what I would call a standard frog, a regular sized body. Let's kick it off with the 2 extremes. Let's talk about the big frogs, then the little frogs, then we'll get into that stuff there in the middle. And then at the end, I'll give you some gear advice as well, just as an added thing. So kicking it off with little frogs, I want to start here because there is a lot of misunderstanding about throwing a smaller frog. A lot of people that are getting into frog fishing mistakenly pick up smaller frogs. The thinking is that traditionally frog fishing can be difficult. It can be hard to walk a frog. Growing up, it was really hard to hook fish on frogs. But frog fishing in general, the equipment, the baits themselves, everything has come so far that it's a completely different animal than it was even 5 years ago, let alone 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. Frog fishing now is really simple compared to what it used to be. Now, small frogs, like I said, a lot of people make the mistake of going small. The smaller the frog, the harder it is to work. You're actually way better off with a giant frog if you're trying to learn how to frog fish. So with small frogs, they don't have a lot of weight. They don't have a lot of mass, which makes it really hard to work them and really simple to overwork them. The biggest mistake people make in frog fishing is that they try to walk a frog too hard. It's this ultra light, ultra soft, just barely touching that frog that will get a good walk out of it. Now, if you're in cover, if you're up on slop or deep in heavy cover, that's a different animal. Any frog will get in there. But if you're trying to get that frog to dance and work, it can be tough. So here are 2 standouts. The first one, the Jackall Kaera. You've seen us throw this frog. You've seen us talk about it. I absolutely love this little guy. Now, it's small compared to, say, a standard frog. It's much smaller, but it's not difficult to use. Most small frogs are really tough. This one's great. The body shape has got a really good walk. The hooks are protected very well, but it's a soft body, so it's easy to get hook exposure. So it's easy to fish. Whether you're throwing it into cover, whether you're walking it in the open water, no matter what, it's not complicated to use. That, by far, in the small frog category, is my favorite. Comes in a handful of different great colors. And for the last year, I have been throwing that thing like crazy and have been very pleased with the results. Catching small fish, catching giant fish, and catching a lot of fish. But if you want one that will walk, that's not hard to use, that is a dynamite option. Now, the only other one in this small category is this guy, a frog that you've probably never seen. This is an Imakatsu. Now, Imakatsu is a higher end brand. This is a more expensive frog, but here's what's interesting about this little guy. Again, smaller the frog, the more difficult to use, usually. This guy makes it on the list because it will outwalk all of the regular size frogs. It's incredible how well this little frog will work. It's got this keeled body, a dual keel, completely different shape, completely different design. And I mean, we're talking different design. It has out barb hooks. I've never seen a frog without barb hooks. But this little guy will walk at the lightest touch. And if you overwork it, which is the biggest mistake you can make, instead of not working, it just gets this super erratic, crazy walk. Out of all the frogs, except for one other, this is hands down the easiest to walk. So you're paying a little bit more for it, but it's a small frog. If they made this in a size larger, it'd probably be one of the most popular frogs on the market. That's an awesome one there. Both of those small frogs are incredible. In a field of frogs that are kind of tough to work, those two are total standouts. Now, let's go to the other end of the spectrum. The great big frogs. First up, the King Daddy, the biggest of frogs. This guy, for perspective, here's that same little jackal that we just had in our hands, the Kaera. Look how much bigger that frog is. It's huge. The King Daddy by Spro is a giant. But they actually did a really good job because a frog this big is really simple for the bass to miss, right? To bounce off it, not get it in their mouth. But this thing is so soft. It collapses so easy that despite its giant size, because they're not the first company to take a shot at making a really big frog, they're just, in my opinion, the first one to do a really good job of it. Despite its size, there's an excellent hookup ratio on this frog because it is so soft. So if you want that bigger profile, if you're trying to catch giant fish, if you're trying to imitate a blackbird or a full-size bluegill or something else, that big giant profile works well. And because of its mass, anybody can walk a big frog like this. You just hit that thing, you can hit it much harder than a small frog and still just get a great walk out of it. Now, something I have done with this frog personally is I like to stick a couple extra weights inside of it. Just literally split shots stuffed in there. You can hear them inside. I've found that with this huge profile, when I'm really trying to catch big fish, if I'm fishing matted vegetation, that extra lead really helps this bait sit low on that mat. It creates a really large presence and will pull fish from a really long way. Next up, this is a Molix. Single tail. And actually, let me say something right there. There's an entire other category of frogs. You know, minnow imitators, bluegill imitators, these like true to life body shapes of little panfish. Completely different category. We may follow up with an entirely different video on those. We'll see. Today is about these traditional frog shapes. When you think, hey, I'm going to go frogging, I'm going to throw a hollow body frog, these are the frogs that we're thinking of, not those strange shapes and outliers. That's a different category. So this guy reaches farther out than probably any of these others. A longer body. It's a wide body. Here it is compared to that King Daddy. So it's smaller than a King Daddy by quite a bit, but it's still quite large compared to what we would consider a standard size frog. Quite large. But Molix, they did something that surprised me here. They made this bait extremely high floating, and they made it so soft it's not even funny. It is the softest frog. I mean, it'll just collapse down to nothing. I could just ball it up in my hand. Because of that, you have an excellent hookup ratio. Now here's something else that's interesting. Because it is so large, because it has so much airspace inside of it, it's extremely high floating. So some frogs, if this is the surface, will sit down in the water a little bit. Some will sit flat in the water. This guy is sitting on top of the water. Very little of that frog is actually subsurface. It walks like a dream. This is the other one. So in the small category, this Imakatsu walks unbelievably. You want that ultra tight, ultra aggressive movement, you've got it. But this guy at the end of a bomber cast, if you threw one out there as far as you could throw and then called me over, I couldn't tell you if you were throwing this or if you were throwing a spook. That's how good this thing walks. It doesn't have that tight little frog walk. It's got an actual walk because it's on top of the surface. It skates across the water extremely well, collapses extremely well, hooks up extremely well. Now, the only thing I'll say about this frog that you need to know going in is it's not particularly waterproof. So every cast or two, give it a squeeze, get the water out, and repeat. It takes on water during the course of walking on a long cast. But even with that said, hookup ratio phenomenal. Molix did a dynamite job with that guy there. From there, let's go poppin' frogs, and then we'll wrap it up with the traditional frogs. All right, let's see. I've got 4 of them here. Let's start with the Gavacho. Jackall Gavacho. If you guys have been with us for a while, you know that we throw this a ton. This is one of the only frogs I throw that has a round bend hook. Almost every frog that I like is a wide gap hook. Almost every one. But something about this body shape, it just doesn't seem to matter. I still have an excellent hookup ratio. When the fish eat it, I get them. So it's got a great cupped face. It has 3 tails instead of 2. So it's got a great presence on the water. Now, something that people don't realize, when they buy popping frogs, most of them are thinking about using them like a popper, which works. It works extremely well. But popping frogs also walk really, really well. Because that cupped face is resisting water. When you pull it forward, it's resisting. It wants to turn naturally. So they're very, very easy to walk. And you can hit them a little harder than a lot of frogs and still get a walk. So again, if frogging isn't your main forte, if it's just something you dabble in or you want to get better at, a cupped face can be a really good option because you can use it as a popper or as a walking frog. The only place that you'll be really unhappy with them is if you're fishing heavy cover. If you're throwing it back in the brush or if you're throwing it up on cheese, up on the actual slop, that stuff will all be catching on that face. It'll drive you nuts. You do not want it for that. But for the other 2 categories, anything in open water, they're great. And the Gavacho for the last year has been by far my personal favorite popping frog. Now, down in the video description, every video, you guys know we link you all the gear. We'll link you every frog that we're talking about. But in addition to that, I'll pick out some of my favorites. Now, it's different for every person. You might have a different favorite than I do, but I'll at least give you that baseline. I'll tell you my favorite one for walking, favorite one for popping, favorite one overall. And we'll give you gear recommendations as well as colors for every one of these because it can get complicated and we want you to keep it really simple and see success this year. So again, the Gavacho. Next up, this guy here, an Evergreen. Very interesting body. First off, it has a fur tail. It's the only one in this list that has a fur tail. And it's got this interesting, it's not truly a cupped face, but it's got these 2 big lips, which act like a popper. So you can pop this thing really well. That cupped face will splash water, but it is an amazing walker. And anything, if you've ever thrown a bait that has a fur tail, once they get wet, the first cast, they don't look very good. Once that tail gets saturated, they come to life. They look unlike anything else. So again, we have standard frogs. We have those sort of bread and butter frogs. And then we have these interesting frogs that are kind of outliers that if a guy is serious about frogging will absolutely have a place in your arsenal. This is one of those. Amazing colors, super soft again. Really, really soft. That different tail. So when this thing's walking, that tail is back there tracking. It's an amazing look. It's an amazing profile. That is a champ. And if you're a serious frogger that wants those baits for different categories, that's one that should be in there. 2 more here. Megabass, the Big Gabot. Much larger than the standard size. They've done some interesting things here. It is a very large frog. I mean, it almost plays with the big frogs. It's much larger than a standard. It's got, again, a very interesting cupped face. It pops extremely well. Ultra soft. Megabass colors. That's a given. The tails are interesting too. They're hooked right into the very back of the body, so they don't impede the hook at all, which is great. That's a really nice touch. The biggest thing with this frog is it has a lot of mass. It's a big frog, so you can hit it really hard. And at a distance, it also walks extremely well. But I will say when I get it in really tight to the boat, it gets tougher to get it to walk. At the end of a cast, it's amazing. But this one for me really truly shines as a popping frog, as an aggressive frog, not as that big, big walker. Last, Spro popping frog. Standard, run-of-the-mill. Anywhere you go in this country, you say, hey, what poppin' frog do you throw? The first thing you're going to hear is that guy right there. Tons of people throw them, and they work. It's a much smaller profile. I mean, let's compare it to that Big Gabot. Much smaller. So whether you're a pond guy, a lake guy, you're fishing the north, the south, fishing out west, it's a size that all of those fish will eat. Now, there are times where you want a much larger or a much smaller frog. And this is neither of those. It's just that standard frog, but nice soft body, solid colors. They're awesome. They work. I mean, nobody would argue a Spro poppin' frog should be on every angler's list across the board. You can pop them, you can walk them. They're a great option and needs to be included. And that brings us to standard frogs. We have 6 more. They're completely out of order. We're just going to run through them here. Let's start with this guy because he's so different than the others. This is a Teckel, okay? But it's not the standard Teckel. And this is what got him into this video. This is the Honker. Have you ever seen a frog with bladed feet? Well, I have. I throw it all the time. There are a couple companies that make them, but this one is by far my favorite. What this frog does is quite different than other frogs. It sits low in the water. Water lines here, it sits like that. It does not sit flat because that metal is heavy, okay? But it walks well. It's got a nice ultra tight walk. They're dragging back there. So nice tight walk. But if you're listening, you'll hear it. Hear the clanking? When you're throwing a frog, you'll hear that clanking too. This shines for me when the water starts to get murky. If it's got some film to it, if I've got an algae bloom, that little difference, that clacking back there behind that frog pulls those bass. If I'm getting short strikes and blow-ups and missing, I turn to this and I put them in the boat. Now, it's another one of those frogs with that round bend hook, like the Gavacho, but a similar body style. Again, it is not my favorite hook, but this body is narrow enough that it works and you can stick them. But those little blades are awesome. When the time comes, when you've got murky conditions, they will get bit. It also doubles because if you get a short strike, you can also throw it like a buzzbait. You can literally just cover water with this thing if you're moving fast and trying to find fish, and those little blades will be back there kicking behind that bait. Just on a straight retrieve, it will catch fish. Really interesting frog. Now the rest of these are those traditional frogs. SnagProof. Bobby's Perfect. If I'm going to throw any SnagProof, it's going to be a Bobby's Perfect. That's by far my favorite one of the bunch. Years and years and years ago, you know, as we were growing up, we would take those SnagProof frogs and you had to cut the legs and tie braid around them and twist the hooks and bend them and tie braid around that and put super glue on them and seal the bodies, all this stuff. Well, when the Bobby's Perfect came out, it incorporated most of those things that we used to do, which was awesome. And it's a solid frog. I don't throw it as much as I used to. It used to be one of my top frogs, and it has slipped for me because the industry has changed so much. I mean, half, 2/3 of the things we're talking about didn't even exist just a few years ago. Frog fishing as a category has exploded. There are so many awesome options. But just because of the history and all the fish that we've caught over the years, you can't do an in-depth review and not at least pull a Bobby's Perfect into the mix. Next up, Bully Wa 2. My personal favorite frog. Just overall, day in and day out, if I've got to grab a frog and go fishing, I grab that one. That's the little Allen color chartreuse belly. Chartreuse belly is everything, and almost no one makes one. It is such a hole in the industry. It works so well. But this frog, like I said, it's my personal favorite. Walks extremely well. You can fish it on or off the mat. Big hooks, soft body, solid hookup ratio. I love that frog. That's my standard. It's what I compare things to personally. But that said, there are a lot of amazing frogs here. You can find some frogs that walk easier. You can find frogs that are softer. Now, one thing I will say, I throw this frog for everything. If I'm grabbing one and going, that's the one. But if you want to get specific, if you want a poppin' frog, not the best one. If you only want a super aggressive darty walking frog, not the best one. So different categories. If you're only fishing slop, see how much keel is in this frog? See how pointed that belly is? And how pointed a lot of these bellies are? The flatter that belly, the better they are in slop. Because when they're pointed like this, they roll over. And that lower hook will tend to catch on cover. So keep that in mind. Don't just listen to which frogs we like. Listen to why we like different frogs. And again, I'm going to include all this in the video description to make it easy. But if I could only have one, that's the one. But if I'm going to get specific, oh, it absolutely branches out. Next up, coppers. Copper's been around a while. These frogs now are so proven. Ultra soft. The only thing softer than this is that Molix, that big walker. Ultra, ultra soft, dynamite hooks, fairly flat belly, but they still walk really well. So great in cover, great in open water. The only thing is they don't have some of my personal favorite colors. That's the only disadvantage. Other than that, they're amazing, and they do have some awesome colors. Those are great frogs and a great size. See, size is key with these guys. They're all very similar. They're all right around that 65 millimeter size. So when you click on a frog, if they offer sizes, we lean towards the higher end. Again, more mass, easier to walk, easier to use. And when you stick those fish, they tend to have bigger hooks in them also. You can really drive them home and catch those big fish. We've got two more. Savage gear. It surprises me that this frog is in here. It surprises me personally. And what I mean by that is, just a few years ago, Savage Gear was one of those brands that made stuff that we just didn't even take into consideration. They have come so far. This frog, I was shocked. So we're going to jump to this one in just a second. This is a Spro. Body shape, extremely similar. But the Savage is quite a bit bigger overall. So similar shape, but much larger size. And they've done an incredible job of protecting the hook. I mean, look, I'm actually going to push. You see that? I mean, I'm not playing. I'm pushing hard to try and get to that hook point. Okay? Now, it's a fairly rigid frog. If you were going to throw this out in open water and walk it, maybe not your best choice. Granted, it walks like a dream. Walks great. It's a phenomenal frog. But it's fairly stiff. So if you want to use it as an open water frog, two recommendations. One is bend the hook up a little bit. Number two is boil the frog to get it softer overall. But that's not the category I would put this frog into. It is a dynamite all-around frog. I'm adding it to my arsenal. Well, I've already added it to my arsenal. It is a fish catcher. It walks great. But the actual spot, the actual niche that I have for this frog in my arsenal is heavy, heavy cover. No one else, all these frogs, nobody else has better protected their hook point. And I have this little category of frogs where I take my other frogs and I modify them for heavy cover. So usually we bend our hooks out and up to get really strong hookup ratios. But if I've got to throw back in wood, way back in tules, way back in bulrushes, I actually take my hooks and I turn them in, which is a hookup ratio killer. But you have to be able to get in and out of that stuff. You have to. If a frog is catching on anything, if there's even a risk that that hook is going to catch, and it's 30 feet back in the brush, you're toast. So you really have to turn those points in. These things are so protected, you don't have to do anything. And when they eat it, they're going to get them because they're not turned in. They're just protected. They're still in perfect position. So when you've got that thing back in the cover and the fish eat it, and you hammer home, it's got a giant hook that's perfectly bent. and you are going to stick those fish. They also did a dynamite job with their colors. I mean, I applaud Savage. They did a really, really good job with that frog. There's no way around it. Now, one thing about that frog, when you open a package, out of all of these, a couple of them have a stronger odor, and this is one of them. So I would recommend, if you're going frog fishing this weekend, get a frog and open the package and let it air out. I wouldn't pop a package and immediately go to fishing. They need to sit for a day or two. When they come out of the package, they have that strong plastic smell, but it dissipates. I'm really, really happy with that guy. Last but certainly not least, Spro Bronzeye 65. Just like with the Poppin frog, the Spro Poppin frog, it has to be there. So does this guy. It has to be there. I would say coast to coast, top to bottom, one of, if not the best-selling frog in the industry is that guy right there. Just an all-around dynamite frog. Notice that fairly flat keel. So it's really, really good in cover, but it still walks extremely well. They've expanded their color line, and their colors rock now. That one's called Freak, and I really like it. A lot of people, when they look at a frog, they only consider the belly color, which is smart, right? You think that thing's a topwater. The bass are just looking at the belly. Because of how we work them, we walk those frogs. When a frog is walking, it's not just flat. They actually roll when they turn. So those fish don't just see here. The way we work them, they see all that side color too. I love this color. I mean, that's awesome. You get that bright chartreuse that I like so much. It's not on the belly. It's a overall black belly, but you get those flashes of that bright chartreuse that I like. That is a cool color. And then again, great body shape. The hook points, if I just slide my finger down without even collapsing the body, if I just slide my finger, I catch. Okay, so because it's sitting flat on the mat, it's not rolling way over, that's still okay for fishing slop, because it'll come across and that slop will never reach up to that hook. For open water, it's a dream. That's what you want, is a hook point that will catch. Take the Bully Wa. Same deal. If I take my Bully Wa and just slide my finger, I catch. That's how that works. So a frog that won't catch, odds are it won't hook up as well, right? Because the fish actually has to eat it and collapse it. If they just come up and graze this frog, they get a hook point. It sticks. That makes a big difference. And then again, it's a soft enough body, it will collapse anyway. So 14 different frogs. My gosh, that was a lot of different baits. But frog fishing is a giant category. I could have done 100. But these are all baits that have a place in my arsenal. You guys know I'm a tackle junkie. Tim is a tackle junkie. We love this stuff. So we get really specific. But again, I'm going to start in the video description. The first couple baits will be an overall best choice. If you just want one frog, this one. If you want the best walking frog, this one. Now let's talk gear. And this is going to circle back around to those little frogs. This is for everybody. Of course, like anything else, I have a favorite frog combo. But it has to do with my body. And what I mean by that is I'm a pretty strong guy. I'm a pretty big guy. And when a big guy goes to hammer a hook set, you carry a lot of mass and you can drive a hook. You can punch it clean through. Smaller people, whether that is a kid, whether that's a woman, whether that is just a smaller guy, it's harder to do that, okay? So what I want to talk to you about is something that I've learned because I'm a guide. All the time that I've spent with people on my boat, I see every shape and size of person out fishing. And I've had so many people on the boat that will use my favorite frog rods and fall in love with them. But I also get people on the boat that use my favorite frog rods and can barely hook a fish. And what I have discovered is that it directly correlates to how large a person is. So check this out. This is my favorite. X-Pride 7.3 Extra Heavy. The reason I like it is twofold. It's got a little bit of tip. I guess it's threefold. Little bit of tip, which makes it easier to walk. Lower section is an absolute broomstick. When you smash that fish, if you want them to come to you, they are coming to you. If you want them out of that cover, they are coming out of that cover. You can lean on them just as hard as you can lean, and force them to do what you want, which is key when you're frogging in heavy cover with big hooks. But last is swing weight. What I mean by that is these rods weigh next to nothing, particularly for the price. Now the downside is they're almost always sold out. It is such a good frog rod you almost can't get them, which is a huge bummer, but they come and go, so always keep an eye for them. But their swing weight is so low that I work a frog with this tiny motion, okay? If a rod is really heavy, that is so hard to do. It will fatigue you almost instantly. But if the rod is really light, you can do it all day long. That's how you get that awesome little darty, ultra tight walk that gets those super aggressive strikes. It's not some big motion like you're walking the dog with a big walking bait. You're just barely touching this thing. I mean, that's how hard I walk a frog. So that makes a difference. However, if I take this rod and I put it in the hands of one of my smaller nephews, they'll blow their hook sets. What I've discovered is that a smaller person, when they go to set the hook, they're not building up enough speed and power before they get to the backbone. So they get to the backbone in that rod so fast that it stops them. It stops their hook set. It actually impacts them, and they don't get a good hook in them. So the smaller you are, I want you to go to a softer rod. You don't necessarily have to go any shorter. 7 foot to 7.3 is perfect. And if you prefer, you go all the way to a 7.6. But 7 foot, 7.2, 7.3, that's primo. Go to a heavy, and if you're really smaller than that, go to a medium heavy. You will be amazed if you go all the way to a medium heavy that you'll have this full hook set before you get to the backbone of the rod. That rod will be loading up while you're still hook setting. And by the time you get to the backbone, you'll slam it. And it will work similarly to when Tim or I set the hook with a great big extra heavy and we just smash that hook set. The outcome is the same. Now, if he or I took an extra heavy, or a bigger guy takes takes a medium heavy and tries to do that, you just completely overpower the rod, and it just doesn't feel right. Now, in order to make this work, hopefully you're still with me. In order to make that difference in rods work, you need to adapt the bait. That is why I gave you bigger frogs, smaller frogs. Small frogs are the way to go if you go to that softer rod, a medium heavy or a heavy. You will have a way better time. If you go to a slightly smaller frog, you can set these hooks so well that rod will load deep. Those fish will have a hard time throwing them when they come up to jump, and your experience frog fishing will go sky high. You will have a blast doing it. I've had so many people come on the boat that flat out do not like frogging. And I say, listen, it's a frogging bite. There's nothing I can do about it, but I'm going to teach you how to do it. And at the end of the day, they love frogging. They just needed a change in their gear and a change in the baits. That is why these two frogs came into play right at the beginning of this video. We're tying it all back together. Because if you just went and got a run-of-the-mill smaller frog, most of them don't have enough mass, and they're a nightmare to walk. It's really hard. So if you're already struggling as a frog angler, that will make it so much worse. But these guys, they walk so well. They walk like a big frog, or even better than a big frog. Excellent hookup ratio. This one is dynamite in cover. This one is incredible in open water. You can really adapt it and fine tune it. And that is what we are about. That's why we do these videos, to help you, whether you're that guy that just wants a frog and you're going fishing, or the guy that's going to really dial it in. Guys, I hope you liked the video. It was a long one. I have a lot to say about frogging. And the sick part is we didn't even actually get into the frogging. You know that's coming though. It's this time of year. More frog stuff is coming. I'm sure there's probably some frog modifications coming. We might even do a video on some of those other body shapes. There's a lot more coming. I love this time of year. I'm sure you guys do too. Get out there and go fishing. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and we'll talk to you soon.